benefit of not being the very first of the day is I know that this has to get adjusted. How's that? Is that good? Great, thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for this invitation to present, and for those in the past, I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Heritage, for hosting us. And Erin, thank you for the attentive work getting all of the speakers here. I am delighted to preview our exhibition, The Shape of Power, Stories of Race and American Sculpture, which opens at SAM in Washington, D.C. in November. It's a project several years in the making, and although it started as something I was curious about, it has fortunately grown to be a project with a large team that includes co-curators Tobias Wofford and Grace Yasamura, who is here today. Thank you for coming, Grace, and for all your support through this project. As well as museum educators, a council of 10 scholarly advisors, and most recently, and this has been one of the most exciting turns in our methodology, a student council of students from Howard University and the Native American and Indigenous Student Alliance at George Mason University. And I have to say, with every conversation, our thinking is sharpened, broadened, and brought to new levels. It's costly to organize a sculpture exhibition. Anyone who's had to move a sculpture, create a pedestal, weigh a sculpture knows that there's a lot involved. And our exhibition would not be possible without support from these foundations. Are my slides advancing? Kind of in a vacuum. Okay, great. SAM holds the largest public collection of American sculpture. And when I arrived just over a decade ago, I thought a lot about through lines in this wealth of material. It struck me how effectively, uniquely, consistently, sculptures seem to be constructing race, especially the historical works. The premise of this exhibition is that American sculpture has in fact played a powerful role in societal constructions of race in the United States, giving physical form to racist hierarchies and shaping how generations have visualized race over the last 2 centuries. Remarkably, this same art form has also been a vital means through which artists have contested and refuted racist ideas, and some have used their medium to protest racial violence and reclaim racial identities. Now, I'll begin with the obvious. Understandably, over the last few years, when I say we're working on an exhibition about race, sculpture, and power, many people most immediately think about monument removals. And this has been in the press so frequently, covering both volatile topplings as well as carefully engineered dismantling of numerous Confederate statues and increasingly some statues of clergy, doctors, statesmen, and others associated with the ideology of white supremacy. The words race and sculpture might also bring to mind the groundswell of new monuments, temporary as well as permanent, erected as communities seek to present more inclusive and critical narratives. In the interest of time, I'm going to cheat. I'm just showing these. I'm not going to talk about them. They're all things that you can also look up pretty easily, as they're mostly contemporary and in recent press. And yet, these impassioned debates about what to remove or erect in the name of racial justice are just the latest chapter in a much longer, under-examined, co-constitutive history of American sculpture and race in this country. Circled here are Luigi Persico's discovery of Columbus and Horatio Greeno's The Rescue, sometimes just simply called Civilization. For more than a century, until 1958, these sculptures bracketed every presidential inauguration. The one we're looking at here is an early photograph of Lincoln's inauguration. And it framed these inaugurations with an unequivocal visual statement in stone about manifest destiny. In a letter of 1837, Greenough explained that his sculpture, the one that was on the right, was meant, quote, to convey the idea of the triumph of the whites over the savage tribes, end quote. Racialized types are also found on the kinds of sculptures that fit in our pockets. And here's the so-called Indian head nickel, designed by an extraordinary sculptor, James Earl Fraser, who combined the features of three men: Oglala Lakota leader, Irontail, leader of Northern Cheyenne, Two Moons, and John Bigtree, Seneca Nation. Fraser argued, quote, his purpose was not to make a portrait, but a type. And this idealized profile, along with the bison on the coin's reverse, conjure the myth of the Old West, which portrayed the decimation of both bison and indigenous peoples as a natural inevitability rather than a consequence of federal policies and strategies of conquest and genocide. And this nickel circulated through millions of palms for 25 years, from 1913 to 1938, placing the stereotyped head into the most mundane actions, like purchasing a loaf of bread or a pocket full of candy. These three works by Greenough, Persico, and Fraser have been retired from public display. And there has been much discourse about the Confederate monuments, but there are so many other existing examples that remain without explanation or interpretation or even a label. Each of the 56 corbels on the Dumbarton Bridge in DC bear the face of an actual person, Kicking Bear, who was Oglala Minneconjou Lakota. His life mask was molded as a specimen by the Smithsonian in 1896 while he was visiting the Capitol. And sculptor Alexander Proctor later used Kicking Bear's face to sculpt this racialized ornament for the bridge, which I said is there are 56 instances across the span of the bridge. These and many other examples visualizing a racialized type who was usually positioned as an other, but sometimes deprecated, sometimes idealized, sometimes romanticized, exoticized, are fundamentally about reinforcing the racial category of whiteness, which is placed at the top of the hierarchy. And with this, there's also a really considerable corpus of white marble sculptures featuring racially white, idealized bodies that are meant to personify an array of virtues, allegories, attributes. And two examples I'm showing are Hiram Powers' Ideal Christ, which is not in the exhibition, and Faith, Hope, Charity. I'm just showing you Hope, which is in the exhibition. Beyond what is narrowly classified as fine art, there are sculptural things, utilitarian, decorative objects, vernacular sculptures of mammies, lawn jockeys, margarita glasses in the shape of sleeping men wearing sombreros, chinoiserie figurines, peppering quotidian life in America. And I don't need to show any of these because I'm sure as I said this, everyone could picture one of each of those examples. And in fact, each of us might add to this litany with other examples, ranging from the monumental to the miniature in both public and domestic spheres. And I was also struck this morning, as another reminder of a category, where I think it might have been a diorama in Wanda Korn's presentation, and I wasn't sure if those were mannequins or real people, Native American women at the World's Fair. And yet, this long history of race-making through sculpture has largely been overlooked. What are the repercussions of such objects populating our world? What are the consequences of normalizing their presence for so long? Sculptors themselves have been perceptive cultural critics, creating works that reference racist historical tropes in order to deconstruct them critically, revealing in the process that racial categories are mutable, subjective, contingent on class, gender, geography, and other variables. And I'm just going to quickly make this point with two works that are in the show. Here, Betty Saar and Judy Baca, respectively, taking on the stereotypes of Aunt Jemima as a mammy, armed here with a rifle and a raised fist of black power, and the sleeping Mexican, here emblazoned with the faces of people participating in the Great American Boycott, Day Without Immigrants March in LA on the 1st of May, 2006. It is one of several works in the show that considers the specific racialization that happens when someone crosses the US southern border. Now, not all of the works that I'm showing here are on the checklist, nor could the exhibition ever be a comprehensive study of the many ways in which American sculpture and race intersect. Let's just call this the first act. And rather, The Shape of Power offers an overview of works variously reinforcing and challenging prevailing ideas about race in the US over time. It includes 82 sculptures made between 1793 and the present by nearly 6 dozen sculptors, fairly evenly split between men and women. 39 of the artists are living, and the majority of sculptures were made between the late 20th century and the present. 40% of the checklist draws from Sam's exceptional collection of sculpture. And I tried to note this with a yellow band in the caption, so that means it's in our permanent collection. And I think Sam has an institutional responsibility to the field to bring this exhibition forward, not only because we have so many works, but also to offer a more complete context for people to understand what these sculptures represent. The exhibition aims to empower viewers with historical context and visual tools to confront the tacit assumptions and unconscious biases that have informed their understanding of race, and to provide space for visitors to share their experiences and thoughts. The exhibition offers American sculpture, in short, as a portal to discuss race in the United States over its long history. So in the time remaining, I'm just going to offer an overview of the exhibition, which is organized thematically. The intro space aims to question how both race and sculpture have been defined historically. This is an area that invites visitors to consider how narrowly sculpture was long defined as representational, made of bronze, marble, maybe, perhaps wood. But these are materials that required years of training, sometimes at great expense, and sometimes with travel to Italy. And this limited who could choose to become a sculptor. This show very consciously includes materials and techniques as eclectic as gourds, glass, hair, fibers, and much more, things that have been historically perhaps classified as part of the decorative arts or craft traditions. So this intro space is a place where we address the ideas of race as a social construct. Race is not biologically determined. Anthropologists and scientists have evidence that humans are more alike than different, and there is no quantifiable biological tie to race, a point that was verified even further by the Human Genome Project a quarter of a century ago. As natural and social scientists Joseph Graves Jr. and Alan Goodman stated in their recent book, Racism, Not Race, race is, quote, a worldview, a social classification, dividing humans into groups based on their appearance and assumed ancestry, and that has been used to establish social hierarchies. And yet, race is very real and has real-life consequences, and every person has a racialized experience, and race is a lived experience. So in this intro space, we're including works that ask viewers to reflect on their own identities through works that not only engage with the rich history of sculpture, but that also offer moving meditations on artists' relationships to identity, history, and community. Alison Saar's sculpture, which you've been looking at for a little while, Mirror, Mirror, shows an adolescent girl who some people might read as white, but who deeply identifies with Black heritage. And Saar gives this girl a cast iron pan as a looking glass as she sorts out the disparity between the labels that are assigned to her and how she self-identifies. Saar's secondary title for this work, Mulatta Searching for Inner Negress, uses historical racialized terms to remind us of the long history of classifying humans by racial categories and how many generations of people have navigated these terms and lives conditioned by the racism that is embedded in these classifications. Saar is also an exceptional printmaker, and I'm showing these two together. The print is in the National Portrait Gallery because I want to argue that, that sculpture is communicating these same ideas in a very different way. Sculpture occupies our space, after all. It invites touch, which is a nightmare for those of us who work in museums, but that's often the mark of a good sculpture, is that you want to touch it. It has tremendous capacity for affect, and sometimes sculptures have served as surrogates for humans in both positive and negative ways. And you might think about death masks of loved ones, but you might also think about mannequins. Perhaps for some visitors, looking at a sculpture in an exhibition might even prompt a reflexive exercise, maybe asking that question, can becoming aware of how we racialize a sculpture, especially a figurative one, make us more aware of how often and how quickly we racialize other people? This next section, The next section looks at the nexus of science, racial construction, and sculpture. In 1930, the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago commissioned Malvina Hoffman to create over 100 sculptures for the Races of Mankind series. And this installation opened in 1933. It was on view for decades. The project was grounded in a eugenics-driven theory that humans were divided into biologically distinct races. Hoffman traveled the world looking for models, and as she noted, each race left its mark upon my consciousness. I watched the natives in their daily life. I chose a moment at which I felt each one represented something characteristic of his race and of no other, end quote. She observed, essentialized, and then sculpted cultural phenotypic variations associated with geographies she visited. But that isn't race. She was guided by anthropometric forms and scientists, which gave this a veneer of truth. But the project was fundamentally a fantastical construction reinforced by the racism embedded in its premise. And I circled the Solomon Islander climbing a palm tree because Hoffman also cast a series of small replicas for private sale. And one of these is in Sam's collection. I'm showing you that reduction piece here. Hoffman works had enormous reach, as they were also used to illustrate the borders of maps and atlases, as you can see here. And these circulated in classrooms, teaching generation after generation to see race through the lens of this commission. This has a parallel in the problematics of looking at 19th century anthropological photography, through which the prejudices of both the photographer and the viewer coalesce to extrapolate and then assign really broad generalizations classifying groups of people based on whatever seems to appear in a single photograph. It's subjectivity repackaged as objective scientific fact. Also in this section, and here are some of the contemporary works in adjacency, are works challenging these classifications of race, such as Huma Baba's The Orientalist. Oriental studies was an entire field of inquiry in European universities from at least the Renaissance onward. Baba references this 1978 book, Orientalism, by Palestinian-American literary theorist Edward Said, who taught at Columbia, who used this term to illuminate the ways that European colonialism has constructed portrayals of people of the so-called East. or the geographic areas encompassing North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Baba points to the continuation of this ideology that exoticizes in others, Arabs and Muslims in particular, constructing them as barbaric, inscrutable, and dangerous. And another work in this section is Raven Halfmoon's Do You Speak Indian? This title is scrawled on the back of the piece, but it's in the round, so where's the front and where's the back anyway in a sculpture? It's a critique of the stereotypes of Native peoples that reduce hundreds of distinctive indigenous sovereignties to a single racialized monolith. Indigeneity as a racial category was a strategy of conquest produced by colonizing powers that presented Native peoples as a relic of the past. As Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird notes, American Indian national assertions of sovereignty, self-determination, and land rights disappeared into U.S. territoriality as indigenous identity becomes a racial identity and citizens of colonized indigenous nations become internal ethnic minorities within the colonizing nation state. Bird goes on to say, racialized indigenous body is then policed in its degrees from whiteness. Half Moon's sculpture, here it is again, makes a statement with this phrase, do you speak Indian, but also through its material, clay, which connects her work to the ancestral knowledge of the Caddo Nation, of which she is a citizen. The physical presence of the artist is evident in the thumbprints that are all over the sculpture's surface, reaffirming and reinforcing Half Moon's statement, we are still here. And so perhaps seeing Half Moon's work and its message of survivance will also productively frame the trope of the so-called noble savage, exemplified in this work in our collection by Ferdinand Petrick, the Dying Tecumseh. This sculpture appears in a section about official spaces, which is an area that looks at how sculptures have been visualizing race as a part of statecraft, or let's say in places that are official, such as the US Capitol, where this sculpture once stood. Although it was privately commissioned, it was in the Capitol from 1864 to 1878, and also widely circulated in stereographs. And this stereograph is when it did appear in the Capitol during roughly the Lincoln administration, or after the Lincoln administration. Petrick titled it after the esteemed Shawnee military leader who was killed in battle in 1813 following his successful formation of a pan-indigenous alliance, bringing together disparate Native nations that found common cause defending their lands and lifeways against the US military. Petrick's portrayal has little to do with that formidable military tactician. The sculpture is highly theatrical. It's really melodramatic in its expression, and the flowing lace-trimmed garments are implausible substitutes for actual battle armor. Petrick borrowed the pose from the Roman antiquity, the dying Gaul, which similarly honors an enemy combatant whom the Romans admired for his warrior prowess, yet nevertheless classified as barbarian. So by referencing this antiquity, Petrick is also having Tecumseh join this timeless, seductive myth of the noble savage. And the sculpture dangerously anchors fiction into this historical framework, making it seem real. It refers to an actual person, after all, an actual battle, a place, a time. All of this is inscribed in the marble. But what effect might a tableau vivant such as this, and it really is an impressive sculpture, it's life-size, if not larger, what effect might this have had on Congress as its members headed to the legislative chambers to vote on matters regarding the so-called Indian Wars? And for context, we're looking at Samuel Morse's painting, which predates the sculpture, but it instructively illustrates Pawnee Chief Petal Sharo observing Congress about to discuss Indian policy of 1822, and he's circled in the upper mezzanine. Congress transferred the the dying Tecumseh to the Smithsonian in 1916, where the museum continued to vivify this trope. In May 1968, while activists founded the American Indian movement, Tecumseh lay dying symbolically, perpetually, surrendering the Pan-Indigenous Confederacy amidst Smithsonian party guests, which included, not shown here, obviously, President and Lady Bird Johnson. Although that crop top feels so presentist. Thomas Moran's majestic landscape, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, visually links the romanticized western frontier of Tecumseh's day, demarked by the Ohio River, with the west of the Rockies, framing this continuous expansion as a seamless, inevitable occurrence. Sculptures like this one helped crystallize this mutable social construction of racialized indigeneity into something that seemed more fixed, more real, more legit. As a recent SAM fellow, Dr. Fabio de Almeida compellingly explained to me and evidenced in this sculpture, this work was started as a political propaganda. An early model was displayed adjacent to the Democratic Convention for the 1840 vice presidential campaign of Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson, who ran with the political slogan where he claimed he had killed Tecumseh. If only we could apply the reading of sculptures in general, this healthy skepticism and criticality with which we customarily read propaganda or political cartoons, rather than being lulled into seeing these sculptures as historical testimonies. In this section, we also, at Statecraft and Official Spaces, we also find Hiram Powers' over life-size figure, America, a failed congressional commission for the US Capitol. It was meant to allegorize the country and the ideals of democracy and freedom through this idealized white female body who steps on the chains of tyranny. Commission fell apart in an antebellum era, and the artist noted, quote, President Franklin Pierce may be afraid that the Southern members of Congress will misinterpret the meaning of the chains under the feet of America and regard her as an abolitionist. Also in this section, although the show is not principally about monuments, we wanted to give people opportunities to think about monuments beyond the Confederacy, and so we include Bryant Baker's winning design for Pioneer Woman. This was the favored design in a 1926 national competition, which included a number of incredible sculptors, to compete to create a monument for Ponca City, Oklahoma. The bronze was funded by an oil magnate, but President Herbert Hoover dedicated the monument on an event that took place on the 41st anniversary of the Land Run of 1889, which opened Oklahoma Territory to settler colonialists. The white pioneer mother is holding a Bible, made a very deliberate visual statement about who belonged and who would be honored with a monument in Oklahoma, a state even then known for its great diversity of indigenous peoples, many of whom were displaced from elsewhere. But sculpture can carry these official messages regardless of size. And the same year that Baker won that monument competition, the federal government also issued this $50 coin commemorating the Oregon Trail and carrying a similar idea about manifest destiny. One more slide. Right. The exhibition moves from the official to the domestic. This section features a number of small-scale works that were made to be placed in the home, such as perhaps a Victorian parlor. And the home, after all, is where many of us are introduced to the idea of race or formulate our first impressions. And sculptures for the home that used racialized tropes sentimentalized and naturalized ideas about race in a place of familiarity and comfort. John Rogers, whose very popular, affordably priced plasters were issued in large editions, sculpted this this ensemble, The Wounded Scout, A Friend in the Swamp, which shows a barefoot African-American man self-emancipating, making his way through a swamp as he physically supports a Union soldier who has been injured on enemy territory. The narrative positions the African-American as physically stronger but subordinate. His role is to ensure the safety of the Union soldier, and in fact, it's the wounded scout who gets the first part of the title. He does this work of support even if it imperils his own life. It's a relationship that Toni Morrison has identified as quite common in American literature, and in her 1992 book, Playing in the Dark, white protagonists are regularly depending upon, quote, complementarity of a figure who can be assumed to be in some way bound, fixed, unfree, and serviceable. Rogers appealed to Northern abolitionist clients in works like this that both celebrate emancipation but in fact reinforce a racist social order. This domestic gallery also includes contemporary works that show artists who've appropriated and then subverted the aesthetic language of historical tropes. Here, Yolanda Lopez's Mexican Chair shows the insidious stereotype of anti-Mexican, anti-immigrant with this, I'm sorry, lost my place, with the sleeping figure who appears on the chair back with the dipped sombrero. Lopez covers the seat cushion with toothpicks that suggest the needles of a cactus, making it a most unwelcoming chair. Whereas Jennifer Ling Dachuk, half is composed of two rounded porcelain powder puffs, instruments of adornment used for making one's skin visibly whiter, lighter, and refined. Half of the work is an unblemished gleaming white, while the surface of the other half is embellished with the blue and white of stereotypically Chinese floral motif. Elegantly modeled handles in the form of chicken feet, widely understood by white non-Asian Americans as a marker of barbarian otherness. It's also an abstract family portrait, as Lynn Dachuk's European father's blonde hair actually occupies the powder puff on the white side, and her Chinese mother's black hair fills the powder puff on the other side. These domestic feminine instruments of beauty and refinement anchor the artist's critical look of how Asian American women are measured against a white ideal and encouraged to alter their appearance to look more Western. There's also a rich history of sculptors making works that protest racial violence and show interracial solidarity. And in this section, we tried to take care to responsibly present a selection. Meta Warrick Fuller was among the first artists to create a sculpture about lynching, and she made this plaster statuette as a personal memorial to Mary Turner, a 19-year-old pregnant black woman lynched by a white mob in Georgia in 1918. In Fuller's statuette, Turner is made whole, fully clothed, cradling her baby as she rises above and away from the grasping hands of the mob. And this work is actually in the Harlem Renaissance Show, which was mentioned earlier today, so you can see it in New York right now before it comes to our show. Aaron Gudelman was a white Jewish immigrant who moved to New York City after surviving anti-Semitic pogroms in his youth in Russia. In New York, he participated in the NAACP's anti-lynching exhibitions, and in 1939, just as World War II was breaking out, he made this sculpture reflecting on the rise of Nazi Germany and the concurrent prevalence of lynching of African Americans in his adopted country. And then most recently, this work, Swing, by Nari Ward, Jamaican-born artist who's worked in Harlem for years and uses found objects from the neighborhood, a tire that he here has suspended from a noose, as well as parts of shoes to create this meditation on violence, survival, community, and the collective powers of protest. Some sculptors ask us to think about racial injustice without explicitly representing a victimized body or sensationalizing the violence. And I'm just quickly showing here Isamu Noguchi's My Arizona, commemorating his 7 lost months incarcerated in Poston, Arizona's internment camp with fellow Japanese Americans during World War II. That red glare suggests surveillance as well as the aerial view of the surrounding desert. While Marion Perkins, an African-American sculptor based in Chicago, was one of many African-Americans who, after the war, questioned the racism behind the US military's detonation of 2 atomic bombs in Japan. This work, Skywatcher, was one of a series that he made and always hoped would become monumental. It features a figure who vigilantly watches the skies, warning of whatever injustice might yet befall marginalized Americans. And this last section of the exhibition presents futurity as a gateway, where viewers invited to think with works that envision alternative modes of being in the world, works that assert and reclaim identities and histories that were deformed by white supremacy. For example, here is Virgil Ortiz's vessel, Pueblo Revolt 2180, which looks back to 1680, the successful Pueblo revolts in which the Pueblo overthrew invading Spanish colonists, at least for a while, drove them out of their lands. Ortiz imagines a future of Pueblo warriors who in 2180 defend their homelands once again. Meta Warwick Fuller, you just saw her work, again appears with Ethiopia Awakening, which is also in the Harlem Renaissance Show. So you can see both of these. A work from 1921. Fuller's sculpture personifies Ethiopia as she awakens. Her bindings fall away, and she becomes this potent symbol for Black liberation. As our co-curator Tobias has noted, for Fuller and many African Americans at the time of the work's creation, Egypt was a place of pharaohs, and Ethiopia was the one uncolonized African nation. Together, they represented the power of ancient kings and the possibilities of African and African American culture. We're very excited to be able to include this 20th century example in this section on futurity, as it's important to remember that it's not only the contemporary artists of today that use sculpture as a place of future dreaming, to borrow an idea from Robin D. Kelly. This last space is about creating a space for visitors to experience moments of joy, tenacity, possibilities that this exhibition offers. It's my last page. Sorry, it's stuck. It isn't just this intersection of race and sculpture that's been understudied. It's, I would argue, American sculpture in general. And Lisa, thank you for always trying to make sure that sculpture is part of these convenings. In his 1984 foreword to Sculpture in America, Wayne Craven wrote, "Not since Laredo Taft's 1903 History of American Sculpture has there been a survey study. One wonders how such a major artistic field could have been long ignored." That was published in 1968 and then reprinted in 1980, and Craven's remains one of the few surveys in American sculpture. But this genre has also been the underdog of American art, with far fewer sculptors than painters. And early on, it seemed that the few publications that focused on the plastic arts were typically concerned with elevating sculpture to this level of painting and therefore championing the achievements of the few professional sculptors as a point of pride, national pride, in fact. Most exhibitions in general typically celebrate works and artists on their checklists, but criticality is urgently necessary and long overdue in American sculpture. There are so few classes, exhibitions, and publications that focus on it. Of course, there have been several monographs and important studies, but until very recently, most of them have not brought together the historical and the contemporary. And I emphasize, too, that this practice of dividing art temporally in both academia and museums has resulted in problematic silos, both of expertise but also methodologies, obscuring a more comprehensive, inclusive look across American art, and especially the history of sculpture. But maybe we're at a turning point in the field. There have been several really exciting exhibitions critically examining American sculpture and sculpture more broadly in the last year, with checklists blending historical and contemporary art. And I note, too, with admiration, the work of Adrian Childs, who has authored parts of some of the things you see on the screen. In closing, what is modern in American sculpture? I think it's the methodology, the expectation that an exhibition is no longer offering a definitive, comprehensive, authoritative last word. Maybe The Shape of Power, the stories of race in American sculpture, will just be an invitation, a prelude, a preface, a first chapter to a new history yet to be written. And I hope you all visit after November. Thank you.
Questions? No questions?
Oh, Joel.
Oh, thanks. That was wonderful, Karen. What a great overview, and I'm sure the exhibition's going to be exciting. Will it include other Harlem Renaissance figures like Catlett, Barthé, Savage?
Yes, there is an Augusta Savage, there is a Barthé. The National Gallery and Brooklyn have a massive Catlett exhibition that is opening first in Brooklyn. So part of our goal, too, was to make sure we introduce artists that were unfamiliar to us even. So we didn't include Catlett, although she certainly would sit comfortably with this roster. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. It was really good. I saw it in the beginning. You had, I guess, this work called Hope that looking at whiteness.
Yeah.
You didn't talk a lot about unpacking whiteness as a racial category. Is that something you're doing, and is it hard to do?
It is hard to do. And I mean, all of this is really hard to do, and I'm glad there's such a big team working on it. There were some sections of the exhibition that I didn't get into, and some of it was about brevity, but Hope appears in a section that is looking at the classical inspirations, maybe, for neoclassical sculpture, and how the role of antiquity is played in the aesthetics of what, how the 18th century, the 19th century in American art regards antiquity, and how whiteness resides in those forms, but also ideologically. So the Hiram Powers America, for example, yeah. And then, it also, the construction of whiteness was a point I made in passing. It's also in the construction of the other. So, it's been hard to do this show in part because we're trying to encourage people to maybe pay attention to race as mutable, unfixed, subjective, and yet we're living in a world where a U.S. Census has boxes, right? And so much of how we navigate the world is about how you've been misidentified or how you identify. And so trying to pay attention to how whiteness is being constructed is maybe something really slippery.
Yeah, it's interesting. I did that. I was a co-curator of Color of Anxiety in the Henry Moore Institute in England.
Yes.
And I had to tell people, there was mostly white sculptures. White is a color.
Yeah.
So when talking about the color of Anxiety, it's not just the black works in there, but white is a color, and we had to think about what that means. So it's kind of interesting, the way people respond.
Yeah. Thank you.
I am Swedish, but my mom is Jewish and my father is an Eskimo. So you see, when people see me, they naturally assume that I am very white, I guess, which is not the case. And I was born and raised in Mombasa, Kenya. So I think it's such an important conversation to have because people always make assumptions about a lot of things and necessarily they're not true. So you can be white as snow, and then you could still be very involved in one subject matter and a culture. And no, we did not have colonies, we know, so. We are not part of that, so, yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm interested in this topic of antiquity and how it's both problematic in conveying ideas of, types and specificity. But at the same time, I thought it was interesting that the last piece you talked about, that sculpture about imagining Ethiopia, how it's both a source of inspiration. So I'm wondering how, in the exhibition, you're trying to straddle that line between antiquity being a source of inspiration and yet also being a source of problems.
Yeah, that is a complicated question. And in the section that looks at antiquity or classicism, there is also a work, there are two works in there that are representing black men, and and they're made in bronze. So again, these things kind of slip all over the place. I mean, even in Adrian's talk this morning, as we were looking at the influence of Africa, I think there's also the influence of the ancient world in what some of the artists are finding when they're in Europe, right? And there's this kind of hybridizing that's happening through the forms. It's so easy to try to make like a fast classification, right? The contemporary is going to get us somewhere. The historical is disastrous, and that's not the intention of the show. And I hope that people slow down and look for things within their context, within their own terms. But so too, antiquity, it's how we absorbed it through Winckelmann and the other thinkers of the 18th century who said the whiter the figure, the more beautiful it is, right? So if this is the leading thinker on antiquity, then you have to ask, well, what happened to how we saw the classical past through the eyes of this 18th century thinker? But it can't just be one thing or the other ever. Yes.
Apologize, this is the last question.
Okay.
Hi.
Thank you.
Do you have any comment to offer about the Martin Luther King monument in Washington that was made out of white marble by a Chinese sculptor?
It's a modern sculpture. It represents our world of today, the technologies, the materials, and in some ways it's looking back at a classical past and using marble, which was always a choice for monuments that endure. So I don't have a critique of it, but I will say, it's given the same space, deferential space. We were trying to film something near there, and we couldn't get a permit because, like the Vietnam Memorial, appropriately, there is an insistence on library-like atmosphere, no public demonstrations. So I think the question isn't always like, what does the monument look like, or how did it get to be here, or what did the artists think, or what materials they used? But the thing about monuments is that we get to see what people do with it once it's in the world. So that's maybe where my focus is now on that monument. Thank you so much for these questions and your time.